So maybe we start with the recent visit of our president to Israel. So how do you see the importance of this visit, taking into account what is going on in European politics and geopolitics in Israel, the war in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, the visit also came within the context of celebrating 30 years of bilateral relations between Israel and Latvia. And we are we have very long and established diplomatic relations. We opened our embassy in Latvia already in 1992. And Latvia has an embassy in Israel since 1995. So we are really one of those countries that very early on established our relation, and we also have very long historical connections, people-to-people connection, which is wonderful. We have a Latvian community in Israel. And President Levitt's visit was a wonderful opportunity to really strengthen and highlight the importance of our relation. And he came along with, of course, also Minister of Economy, but also a very large delegation of 60 business people. And during his visit, we also managed to have a business forum, and also LIA announced of their opening of a LIA branch, the investment agency in Israel. So we're also hoping very much to advance our economic relations. And of course, the president had a lot of high-level political meetings, first of all with his counterpart, President Herzog. President Herzog also has roots in Latvia. His mother lived in Riga. So this is part of what I was saying about very strong people-to-people connections that we had. And he met the outgoing prime minister and the incoming prime minister, so both Yair Lapid and Benjamin Netanyahu. And during those meetings, we of course discussed also war in Ukraine, developments in Europe, also developments in each country, as it was an outgoing government. All these conversations were held with extreme friendly and openness and understanding of both sides. So I think it was a wonderful way to kind of showcase the 30 years of relations. And we also signed 4 MOUs, especially on health cooperation, where we have a lot to learn from one another.
And then for people who are not in the diplomatic corps, so Israel and Latvia are pretty far away. So what in reality those cooperation agreements could mean to both Israeli and Latvian economies and societies?
So these MOUs were signed mainly in health. So it was a lot about also cancer treatment, because in Israel we really have leading capabilities in research and technologies for cancer. So a lot of cancer and accurate medicine methods, but also we have unique centers like we have the ARC Center. It's about Center for Research and Development in Medical Technologies that we're also trying to cooperate with Latvia Children's Hospital. We know also that the Children's Hospital is interested in developing all kinds of like early detection for autism. So this is something also we are interested in cooperating. They also discussed about autoimmune diseases, cooperation in research in autoimmune diseases. So in these many fields of health, there's a lot that we can cooperate on. Yeah, hopefully also, you know, to the advantage of Latvian citizens.
Yeah. And Latvia, being a small country, and Israel is bigger, right? Then we're looking for ways, you know, how do you grow a very small country in a big globalized world where economies of scale matter? So maybe you can share the story. You know, what was the roadmap for Israel to get to this high level of, for example, healthcare? How did he manage to create leading hospitals in a small country?
Wow. Well, we have a very unique health system. And this health system is mainly built on 4 health providers. And all country citizens must be a client of a certain health provider. One of them, and you can choose. And they have very well-based clinics and offices all over the country. So you can choose really whoever you want. But being part of this health provider, you pay a very symbolic fee for medical services, but then you get access to really excellent quality services. So some of them are government funded. Others, of course, it's like, I'm talking about like 25 shekels, which is, I'm trying to, €7 a month?
Yeah, something like that, yes.
And you have a card, and with this card you're entitled for a really, really large basket of medical treatments. And this was especially shown when during COVID time. Because in COVID time, every citizen of Israel is attached to a certain health providers. All the health providers, it's all digitalized. And here I emphasize the importance of being digitalized, because if you don't know and you don't have the proper data of the people, you can't start conducting such a huge operation as COVID, for example. And for us, it was rather easy because all the health systems were involved. They all texted their clients. They say on this and this date, you have a vaccine. We have very clear registration who was vaccinated. And it was also part of, a trust system, because when the citizens trust the government and they trust the health authorities, and they know, and in Israel, we're always kind of a country that's on alert mode, So we have very high levels of trust in the country, and we're always in a mode of emergency. So when we hear, okay, everybody has to come, we kind of report to Judy, in a sense. So it's easier in that way. But all the technological aspects of medical, but not only medical, it's a wider, for Israel, I would say, development and research and development is part of our DNA. Because we're a country with very small resources, we don't have oil so much. We are living in a semi-arid zone. We don't have water. We don't have many things, to be very honest. So we have to invent them. So we say, that necessity is the father of innovation. So since we didn't have, so we had to invent. So that also applies for medical, but not only medical, for security, for agriculture, because you don't have water. For example, so drip irrigation, for example, which is an Israeli invention, but it came from the lack of water. So it's a larger setup of, Israeli mindset. And part of it is also being very self-reliant. We rely on ourselves, and we don't expect others either to defend us or to provide us. We really put an emphasis on being self-reliant as a country.
And as a society, how would you compare Israeli society reaction to COVID? You had very high rates of vaccination. You did vaccinate people the first. You were super organized. You got a very good price for vaccines. You famously had the Secret Service agreed on the price of vaccine. So was it a rumor? I don't know. But if you compare this to the reaction in the European countries, you mentioned being disciplined. And then, of course, if everybody in the country was in the army once, so naturally the society is probably much more disciplined. So what are your reflections?
So I think again, it's part of this emergency mode that we're used to it. So of course it has its negative implications of being constantly on very high alert, but then it has its positive sides, that when you do have a crisis, and in this case it was a medical crisis, that everybody is recruited. And we have very good connection also between our civil authorities, security authorities. So everybody was kind of, joined forces into this effort. And because of this sense of emergency, then we operate very quickly. For European countries, for example, there was the EU. And the EU was negotiating for a lot of European countries. And of course, it's a much more complicated system to work with. It also has a lot of disadvantages, but it's also very complicated, and you need certain authorizations, and you have the commission, etc. In Israel, it's one country. We have quite, decisive and quick decision makers. And once they decide something, they operate. So in a sense, in certain cases, it's easier to operate that way.
Is there a noticeable anti-vaxxer movement in Israel?
No, not really. No, not at the moment, but no, not even then. There was, of course, some anti-vaxxers. We also had people who were objecting to to
the vaccination.
To the vaccination on religious basis, and that also required a dialogue, but not a major movement of anti-vaxxers.
Because I'm like really curious about like non-obvious things. For example, it seems that in China they were not able to convince the population to vaccinate. On the other side, there were pretty notable situations in New York, in the Jewish community in New York, where they didn't want to vaccinate, and there were pretty interesting cases when people didn't want to vaccinate their children, right? And then kind of trying to understand what do we learn about how societies operate when we look at those, unique situations when people, they could say yes or they could say no in the situation of pretty limited information and pretty high level of stress.
I think it really required a dialogue with a lot of sensitivity. Because when you're aware of the religious concerns, you have to operate very wisely.
Yes.
Because just imposing won't work. And then there was a conversation and dialogue with religious leaders and how it can be done. And they also found their own solutions, So like, let's say more closer to synagogues, or also providing certain food or meals, community meals, or things like that, and also explaining to the population about the vaccination was very, very important. Of course, there were still those who objected, and we encountered similar problems. But I can say that an interesting fact, that despite COVID, our economy survived very well, and projections were quite grim. But during COVID and even the past year, we grew some of those years 8%, and last year was more than 6.5%. So we have very resilient economy.
Resilient, yes.
Which is very good. So also recovering from COVID was very good.
If we broaden the discussion a little bit into innovation ecosystem. We know about Israel as a startup nation. The book was published something like 15 years ago, so it's
and it's still very much in demand, yes.
It is still very much in demand, right? I mean, one of the questions that I had in that regard was that startup nation is good, but then for economy, scale-up nation is more important. So when there is a startup and the startup grows into a big firm, and that's something that we have not really seen as much in Israel. It's now better. Right? So maybe you could talk about the broader ecosystem of economic actors, startups, and other firms, and how does the government sees that development? How does the government help?
Okay. So I think Israel has a very unique setup that involves many, many elements. So because, as I said before, we didn't have, so we had to invent. So we started with trying just the basic agricultural needs of drip irrigation, etc. But we started getting into the innovation mode. On the other hand, we also had the military. And even in 1948, we already established the Science Corps of the military. So already from the beginning, there was a strong emphasis, first of all, on quality over quantity, and that we will always have the advantage, the technological advantage, but also the intelligence advantage, okay? Now, once you have this in the army, this is of course supported by government, then the army already trains a lot of, engineers, a lot of communication people. When they finish their army service, where do they go? They go into industry, into companies, etc. Also universities. Already from the 50s, we had our first R&D center, let's say, in the University of Haifa in the Technion. And that also strengthened the relations between academy and industry, military and industry, civilian engineers. So we somehow created this community of developers, of engineers. And after international community noticed that Israel is advancing all kinds of civilian, agriculture, but also military, they started investing in Israel already in the 70s. So we had already in the 70s company like IBM, and Motorola investing in Israel. And that brought a lot of international knowledge, So also this flow of international knowledge into Israel, that became a very, very strong component. So this community grew, and then also government started legislations to promote high-tech and innovation in Israel. And that process that started in the 80s more or less coincided that in the 90s, for example, the Soviet Union collapsed and we received about 1 million Jewish Russians who came to Israel, and many of them were engineers and scientists. So that highly contributed as well to Israel. And today we have the Innovation Authority. Innovation Authority is part of the government's branch to invest in innovation, to provide funds and grants for new startups and companies, also connecting them with international companies and all kinds of projects, and such as Horizon in Europe and etc. And we also have all kinds of initiatives, like we have something quite unique in Israel, what we call the Startup Central. It's a database, basically, of all the companies in Israel that deal with startup. And let's say you're interested in cooperating with, I don't know, meatless meat company. So you go to Startup Central and you say alternative proteins, and you get the companies, and it makes things much, much more easier to also do research. They're like a think tank as well, and they also recommend to governments on all kinds of policy. So we have a very specific ecosystem supporting innovation. And currently, our high-tech industry accounts for more than 54% of our import, which is huge. More than 10% of Israelis work in high-tech, which is also big.
I'm talking to many people about that topic, and everybody wants to copy San Francisco or Israel. And then the question I always have, talking to people, say in Norway and Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, how much does, really government change anything? How much can you really copy? Because it seems like, when somebody wants to do a startup, initiative, they try to copy, the bricks of San Francisco, so everything looks like San Francisco, and then you can do that, but then not always, something happens.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you see that? Is it like really something that we can create from government perspective, or is it some sort of magic that kind of happens?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't think copying is the right word.
Okay.
Really, I think each country has to examine their own, policies, their own setup, because as I said, we are very well connected. In Israel, the security establishment is a big part of the innovation. Not in every country, it's the same. So I think each country has its unique characteristics. And according to these characteristics, I think the government has to apply certain policies. These policies, it's always better if you, of course, consult, with the industries, etc., to have this very open dialogue with industries and business community. But copying, I don't think will work. I think it's always very individual for each and every country. I know Baltic states cooperate a lot, and still, and you're very similar in your sister countries, and still you see very big differences. Estonia has different policies, Lithuania, Latvia.
It is kind of developing, but if you look at the reality of, the big cloud companies, the reality of big artificial intelligence companies, that unfortunately, so if you put something into a cloud, you put it into a cloud that comes from the United States, right? And if you take this as a kind of as a baseline, then it becomes really interesting to talk about this point, because you don't see, it's not really obvious that in Europe we've produced a lot of that. But maybe you've mentioned the army. Because of the war in Ukraine, Latvia has reintroduced conscription. And, I've read the law, and then the law states that, people will be conscripted, and it's mostly boys, right? And I kind of, it was kind of, in a sense, it didn't sound right, but I said, okay, it's kind of logical. But then somebody told me that, hey, if you recreate the army, which, we will do, you have this one point of creating the army which represents both genders, or many genders. And that's kind of a loss if you kind of go back into male defined and dominated army. And then Israel is famously an army which, you know, everybody serves in the army. Yeah. So maybe you can talk about it from that perspective. What does it mean, and what changes in the army, what changes in society when, you know, both men and women are there, and what maybe then what we are missing now by not doing that?
Well, first of all, I can say that I also served in the army for about 3 years.
I didn't. Yes, I did. And it's 3 years. It's not 1, it's not 2, it's 3.
No, for me
it's
was
a long
3.
time.
For me it was 3.
Yeah.
Usually for women it's 2, and for men it's 3.
Yes.
But we are growing up with the knowledge that we will go into the army, you know? And when I think of the army, when I was younger, much younger, I always thought, well, I would like to do what my sister did, you know, or what, like your friends do, you know? It becomes very, you want to, some families have this pride, you know, we always go in our family to, I don't know, either infantry or to artillery or to, you know, so it becomes very like much, it's really deep in society that you know you are going to serve the army and this is your duty. It's also a sense of pride, to be honest, because as citizens...
Huge sense of pride, yes.
Yes, because
Israel,
of citizens, you feel you contribute to your country, you know? And for me, as a woman, it was important that also women are there.
Where did you serve?
I served in oh, I don't know how to translate it in English. I served in Nahal. But I did like basic training for girls. Okay. So I taught girls how to use the gun. I was handling the fire range. You know, I had 80 girls underneath me that I was teaching them from either, you know, a very emergency, quick medical treatment to everything about the weapon. And I'm quite good with my M16. So, but anyway, it gives you a sense of pride. And I think for women, it's also very empowering, you know, not just to see soldiers, male soldiers, I mean, but women, that they're equally, you know, carrying the responsibility, because we are equal part of society. And in Israel, it came about because we were a very small state when we were established, with a very small population. It was clear that we need everyone. We can't spare anyone. We don't have enough to spare. And that was the rationale. And I think it's up to Latvia to decide, of course, how you want to proceed. But I also think you need some social preparedness. I mean, active social preparedness. You need to work with public and to notify public and to prepare public for such a big, you know, step that the country is taking. Yeah.
I was pretty surprised when I thought about it, how quickly we recreated the same stereotype, because it is important that everybody in society participates, and when you create one-sided cultures, then, you know, you end up with one-sided cultures, right?
Yeah, so I think, and I think also armies, you know, they are a huge instrument in creating a more solidified society. Because it really contributes, you know, both the relations that you have during your army service. You know, we say it's always like friends for life. But also this sense that we're all in this together. And in Israel, we had people coming from all over the world. It was amazing. Like you had Yemenites coming, Iraqis, Egyptians, Europeans, Americans, South Americans, everybody came to Israel. And what unified everyone, and it was clear that everyone is equal, was the army. So I think it's a powerful...
A totally different question, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Then Israel, Latvia are similar in their relationship with the language, right? So in Israel, you have recreated Hebrew. Yeah. And then you have an educational system, a very strong educational system that is in Hebrew. But then, of course, being a small country, of course, you know, there is influence of English, influence of French. And then in Latvia, the situation is the same. It's even more difficult. The country is smaller. So how do you drive your policy in a way that you can ensure high level of education, especially in the universities, while maintaining or developing or sustaining cultural environment for Hebrew as your language?
Okay, it's interesting because in Israel, the Jewish population studies in Hebrew.
Yeah.
The Arab population studies usually in Arabic, and this is perfectly fine with us. I mean, they can study in Arabic. We don't enforce them.
High schools, you mean?
Also in high schools,
Yeah,
yes.
high school.
Universities, of course, the Israeli universities, it's all in Hebrew. But everybody in Israel has a very high level of English. It's also because a lot of people are English speakers who came to Israel. I can tell you where I grew up. I heard Hebrew and English all the time.
All the time, okay.
And my father's from New York, but also the community around us, South Africans, Australians, so people, there are a lot of native English speakers in Israel, or native families, so very high level of English. I could say that unfortunately, we don't have enough languages like European, and I think also probably in Latvia, you also teach other European languages. In Israel, it's compulsory only English and Arabic in that sense. So the Hebrew, let's say, educational environment is very, very well established, and the higher education level, of course, as well, yeah. But we don't see any tension, let's say, as you described. Yeah.
So talking about Hebrew and Arabic, I cannot not mention that the Fauda series.
Series.
Yes, yes. What's your impression of that movie? Because for us it was such an eye-opener how they were able to show both ethnic groups.
Yeah.
I watched it, in original language with subtitles, how both languages sound familiar actually. And the first thing you learn is to distinguish
the Hebrew
right?
and Arabic.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So what impact had the movie in Israel? And in Arab? As far as I understand, it's hugely popular in the Arab population.
It's interesting. It's really interesting showcase but it's a very popular show in Israel, really. I think one of the elements that they managed to do it so well because some of the creators were actually serving actively in one of those units who went undercover into Palestinian territories, etc. So they both know how the Israeli side feels, but of course being there, they also sense the local sentiment. And I think they were very wise in showing both perspectives and how it's extremely difficult and complicated and emotional for both sides, and how both sides pay unbelievable prices, because of this conflict. But I think it's always meaningful that you can show, both. If you only show one, it's less credible,
It was unbelievable.
If you show,
I understood that they're showing both sides. I think in the middle, I really believed that they are really showing both sides in the middle of the first series, right? And then it was like the power of art. When you just show how people feel on one side and on the other side, and you kind of don't choose sides. Yeah,
very true. And you also saw women there.
Yes, yes.
In the series, just to connect to our previous point, there are also women there.
Yes, and very strong, very interesting personalities.
Yeah.
Right, in very difficult, impossible conditions. Yeah. Yes. True. So, thank you for coming.